Miss Lizzie. Come over here, have a moment with me. My name is Miss Lizzie. I don't ever smoke the dizzy, but we can always share some ditsies. It's just a cup in time. This song doesn't have to rhyme. Life's all of us, not every moment we can be feeling fine. I wanna share a moment, just a second if you will, maybe even a cup of thrill. We could share this performance. It's tea time, come sit with me.
Oh, welcome guys, Miss Liz back in the house, and we had an incredible afternoon. We had a lot of giggles this afternoon with TK Bash and getting her book out there. Tonight we have the incredible Sebastien de Castell in the house, and we're going to be talking about his book, and his book is called Our Lady of Blades. We're going to get deep into that. We do have he does have his copy with him, and I do have an image, so we're going to pull that up and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about his tea, and his tea tonight is adventure, romance, and travel. So that sounds like an interesting cup of tea that we're serving tonight in this house. But before we get started, you guys know how Miss Liz rolls. Get over to all those platforms, network platforms, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Clapper, Lemonade, Blue Sky, all those good platforms. And if I haven't mentioned them, check out all the other ones. Miss Liz is on all of those as well. Check out the podcast apps as well: Podbean, Listen Notes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and all the ones I haven't mentioned, Miss Liz is on there too. So check those out. And jump over to babyboomer.org. If you're looking for something different and Miss Liz is not bringing that flavor that you enjoy, you can check out over 50 different podcast apps on babyboomer.org, and Miss Liz is partnered up with them. So check that out as well. Be sure to keep following and liking and subscribing and getting these tea times out there, because they do make a difference. So let's get started with disclaimer and then a beautiful intro, and then we're going to get Sebastien in here and we're going to spill some tea and have some fun tonight. Disclaimer for Miss Liz's Tea Time live show. Miss Liz's Tea Time is a global platform dedicating to sharing real-life stories, diverse perspectives, and meaningful conversations that inspire awareness, healing, and connection. I'm Miss Liz is going live using StreamYard. Before leaving a comment during the live broadcast, please grant StreamYard permission to display your name at StreamYard.com. Please be advised that all the content brought forward during any Tea Time show is presented in good faith. However, discussions may include opinions, beliefs, and perspectives that do not necessarily represent the views of Miss Liz or the Tea Time platform. Information shared by guests is based on their own experiences and is perceived to be accurate at the given time of airing. All guests, viewers, and participants are responsible for using their own good judgment when considering any action or decision that may relate to these discussions. Some episodes may cover sensitive topics, including but not limited to trauma, abuse, grief, mental health, and other emotionally triggering subjects. Listeners' and viewers' discretion is strongly advised. Tea Time with Miss Liz is an open discussion forum designed to offer insight, inspire awareness, and create connection. It is not a substitute for professional, medical, legal, or therapeutical advice. If you require professional support, please seek assistance from qualified professionals or trusted resources in your area. If you have any questions regarding this disclaimer or the content of the discussions, you are welcome to contact me, aka Miss Liz, directly at my email at bookingmissliz@gmail.com, or visit my link tree at Miss Liz's Tea Time. By choosing to participate in, comment on, or view these live shows, you acknowledge and accept this disclaimer. Your participation is entirely voluntary. I, Miss Liz, welcomes you to join the conversation with an open heart, and if at any time you feel this platform is not right for you, I respect your decision and welcome you back whenever you are ready. Tea Time with Miss Liz is serving truth and awareness one cup at a time. Well, welcome to Tea Time with Miss Liz, where stories remind us that courage is not only found on battlefields or inside fantasy worlds. Sometimes courage is found in the choices we make, the identities we carry, and the truths we dare to face within ourselves. Today's guest brings imagination, wit, adventure, and emotional depth to the Tea Time table through stories that have captivated readers around the world. Please join me in welcoming Sebastien de Castell, international best-selling fantasy author, storyteller, and creator of beloved series, including the Greatcoats, Spells, Slingers, and the Court of Shadows. Known for blending sharp humor, unforgettable characters, swordplay, friendship, loss, resilience, and moral complexity, Sebastian's writing explores far more than fantasy adventures. His stories dive deeply into identity, belonging, loyalty, self-worth, and the messy, beautiful reality of being a human. Before becoming an author, Sebastian worked in archaeology, music, product development, and education. Experiences that help shape the rich world and layer character readers connect with so deeply today. Today's Tea Time will explore the power of storytelling and imagination, fantasy as a mirror of humanity, resilience, identity, and personal growth, friendship, loyalty, and moral choices. What stories teaches us about ourselves? Sebastian reminds us that fantasy is not about escaping reality. Sometimes it helps us better to understand it. So grab your cup and join us for a thought-provoking and adventurous conversation filled with creativity, insight, and real-life tea. Truth, experience, and awareness. And let me get Sebastian in here and let's spill some tea. Let me pop him in here. There we go. It's like popcorn, right? In and out. So, Sebastian, if we could get to know you a little bit, can you hear me, Sebastian?
I can hear you just fine.
Oh, there we go. So if we could get to know you a little bit before we dive into the books and all the other good stuff that I have on the table here for all my listeners, who was Sebastian as a little guy and who's Sebastian now?
Wow. As a little guy, I guess I was shy. I was, scared of the world, generally speaking. Like a lot of kids, I was a dreamer, and spent both a lot of time kind of in the fantasy world, both of my own imagination and those of the books I was fortunate enough to get to read, but also kind of struggling to reconcile those two worlds, the world of our imagination, which is often in a way the world that we think it ought to be, and then the world that we find ourselves in. And so, when I was, as I was sort of growing through my teenage years, when I was 16 years old or 15 years old, I went on a camping trip by myself on an island off the coast of British Columbia. And I'm a terrible camper. My tent had holes in it, and I brought a leather jacket for clothing, which is a really bad idea if you're ever camping, especially in what amounts to a temperate rainforest. And I was I was getting on a ferry to go to the next island and missed the ferry, of course, as I'm wont to do. But I happened to have a book with me, which I think I have a copy of it here, called Bard by Keith Taylor, which is a wonderful fantasy adventure about a 6th century Irish bard who travels the world, swings a sword, goes on adventures, sings songs, and tells stories. And I suddenly discovered, you know what? That's the life for me. That's the job I want to have. Unfortunately, of course, there was not much in the job, in the job market for traveling bards. So I ended up just going on a journey of being a traveling musician, choreographing sword fights for the theater at various points, teaching, going through all kinds of different little adventures, and they all culminated eventually in becoming a fantasy author myself. So I got to kind of go from that little kid trying to imagine a different world to not quite becoming a bard, but maybe doing so in the aggregate.
So, Sebastian, how old were you when you started your writing journey?
I was a lot older than most people, because when I was a kid, I didn't really write much at all. The longest thing I think I ever wrote was a 2-page poem in high school that we were required to write. But I'd always kind of had that dream of, I would go to the bookstore and buy these, fantasy novels, and I love the paperback fantasy novels. They were just this kind of perfect unit, they fit in your big pocket of your coat. And they just, every one of them was kind of a promise of an adventure. And, as you alluded to off the top, I'm someone who doesn't think that fantasy is just for escaping the world. Sometimes it's for giving us a chance to re-enchant our own world. We go off into a fantasy world, we find things we love, and then we go, how do I bring some of that into my own life? but I was never the kid that anybody said, oh, what an artist, he's absolutely going to. In fact, I remember I was still working at Vancouver Film School, which is a wonderful school. I loved my time there, and I was helping with curriculum development. So we have these different programs, and they're very, very intense, and they're very expensive for students. And so they have to be really good. And I was working with one of the departments, I think it was the acting department at the time. And I was trying to help them through how the artistic side of the curriculum fit within the structure of an educational institution. And I remember one of the senior instructors said, well, you really shouldn't talk about the art. I mean, look, you're a good, you're a spreadsheet PowerPoint guy, but you shouldn't do the art. And I didn't bother telling him at the time I had just sold my debut novel, which ended up being the first 4-book series, The Greatcoats, which I was very fortunate with the success. It led to an 8-book series called Slinger. It's a YA series that's been translated into more than a dozen languages worldwide, an option for film and TV. And so, yeah, my real start came when I was 27 was the first time I wrote a fantasy novel or wrote a novel at all. And at the time I was a full-time traveling musician, making like $250 a week, playing Brown Eyed Girl 3 times a night. And I was being sued by the bass player, who told a very terrible or a very struggling cover band, which is a bit of a creative low. And so I did what I always do when the world gets too complicated, which is I went to the library. Because when you walk, libraries are kind of cathedrals of humanity, aren't they? You walk in and there's just every different subject you can imagine. Nobody tells you what you can or can't read. Nobody tells you what you should or shouldn't think, and you just go off and wander. And I found a box of cassette tapes called, with a title on the box that was called "Let's Write a Mystery" by Ralph McInerney. And it was literally a box with 12 cassette tapes in it and this manuscript of a mystery novel. And I took it home and I had to find a cassette player, because even then, this is the end of the 90s, you couldn't really, nobody had cassette players at home. But when I did, it was literally a course written by this actually quite well-known mystery author named Ralph McInerney, telling you to write your first book. And it was just this very patient 1960s science professor sort of voice telling you, have you done your pages? If you haven't done your pages, stop the cassette, go do your pages. And something about that wonderful kind of warm, sort of very unobtrusive, unthreatening, undemanding approach allowed me for the first time in my life to write a novel. And it was a terrible archaeological mystery. I was trying to make use of my archaeology degree, because literally that was the only use I ever made of it, even though it was a wonderful degree and it sort of helped shape my thinking about the world. But it was such a wonderful experience to complete a novel that I honestly wasn't even worried about selling it. I just felt so satisfied from that experience. It helped me do everything else in my life better. But years later, I decided, I'm going to write another novel. And I sat down and did a thing called the 3-day novel writing contest, which has been around for over 40 years. And I had this idea in my head about these 3 swordsmen who had struggled to live up to a set of ideals that they believed in their whole lives, and that seemed to have turned out to be completely wrong. And I was curious what would happen then. And that became a manuscript called Traitor's Blade, which is what launched my writing career.
You'd mentioned a 3 days writing contest. Is that where you have to write like 70,000 words or something in 3 days?
No, they're much more gentle than that. I think people are expected to try to get at least 10,000 words. It was, I remember when I was doing it, I literally decided to do it on the last day, like the night before it started. And I had to run to a cafe where apparently that in Vancouver, where that's, because it's all around the world, but in Vancouver, that's where you submitted your registration. And usually people start at midnight on the nose, and they have stacks of notes and outlines, and then they try to write, 10, 15, maybe 20,000 words. I started with literally nothing, and I went to bed. I got up at 7:30 the next morning. I still wasn't sure what story I was going to write. I had 3 different ideas, and then I picked the one that spoke to me. And I actually had a gig I had to perform as a musician that weekend. I had to sing at a wedding, and I had to sing "The Lady in Red" by Chris de Burgh, which is a horrible song I have to sing. But I managed to get through it. But over the course of those 3 days, I slept better than I almost ever sleep. And I did that gig, and I wrote every other moment of it. And I wrote 44,000 words.
Whoa.
Yeah, which is a lot. I think I've only really exceeded that one other time where I think I wrote 75,000 words in 3 days. I didn't win the contest, of course, but that didn't really matter because a few years later I decided, I'd had so much good fortune in my career, in the entertainment business, teaching and being a director at Vancouver Film School, that I was ready for a new challenge. And so I revised the manuscript. It became more than twice as long as the original, and then got lucky enough to get a literary agent and lucky enough to get a 4-book deal, and it was all sort of a kind of a rocket ship from there.
So, Sebastian, when you went in the library, I know when I was little, I go in the library and I thought it was like different worlds, right? Because of the different genres. So I kind of like, it was almost like Alice in Wonderland, going down the rabbit holes, right? So you go down this row, that was fantasy. You go down this row, it was horror, right? So you wouldn't want to go down that road, and then there was a humor, and then there was a children's books. When you were little, when you went into the library in school, I know that they used to have librarians, they've taken that out, and they used to read the stories. Did you ever imagine yourself in the stories as they were reading the stories to you?
Yeah, I frequently did. And actually, one of the things that taught me about books and just about humanity is one of my favorite novels, especially my favorite, for want of a better term, children's novel. In fact, I also happen to have it right here. I keep it with me, is Dragon Song by Anne McCaffrey. And this is set in her very famous world. She wrote about all these dragons, the Dragon Riders of Pern, it was called. But this was a kind of a children's novel, or a young adult novel, about this young woman who lives in this place where, she's, it's a seaside. They're not very interested in music. All she wants to be is what's called a harper. It's a kind of a bard or a minstrel. And she's not allowed to because she's a girl and no one expects her to do that. And she ends up having to run away. She finds these tiny dragons. Adventure ensues. But the funny thing was, I had nothing in common with her. I wasn't in an environment where people were not supportive of artistic endeavors. No one ever told me I couldn't do anything. I was born, with sort of the privileges that come from, being a, sort of white guy, able-bodied, straight, cisgendered, all of those kind of things. So, those don't necessarily give you a giant leg up in the world. They just mean nobody's ever telling you can't do something. So my life was very different from Melody's, the character in Dragon Song. And yet I could feel, when I read those pages, everything that the story was saying she was feeling. Because even if we don't all live the same lives, we do all experience, for the most part, the same emotions. We know what it's like to be told you can't do something. We know what it's like to be lonely. We know what it's like to feel like no one hears us or cares about what we have to say. And so that kind of really guided me, that experience of being the fact that in a fantasy novel, I could go into that and feel what a character was feeling like, even though they had nothing in common with me. Which, has sort of translated over the years, because Our Lady of Blades, which is my 18th novel and my latest one, is entirely about two sisters. So, people who, very different lives and identities from my own. But the reason I felt like I could write that novel was in part just from having experienced so often being able to empathize with characters that weren't like me in other novels.
Well, let's talk about that book. I'm going to pull it up for my viewers out there. Our Lady of Blades. I love this cover, by the way. It is gorgeous. But for my audio listeners, could you just explain what's on the cover and the colors and all that good stuff, Sebastian?
Yeah, actually, I love the cover design. This is something that I was lucky enough to get to basically art direct. Usually, when you're a novelist, you don't get to commission your own covers when you're published by a traditional publisher. My publishers have been kind enough to let me do that with some books, and certainly to have input on them, which has always been wonderful because it's a wonderfully collaborative process. With this one, I wanted something that was strong in terms of a lot of fantasy covers you see today are what we call typographically based. Like the title is very ornate and there's lots of flowers and decoration sort of around it. But they tend to then not have any kind of sense of figure or character in it. And I really wanted to emphasize the sense of mystery and identity and hidden identities. So if one of your listeners was staring at the cover right now, they would see this very beautiful title sort of in silvery letters with a sword crossing it. It's Our Lady of Blades. They would see the sort of ornamentation around it that signifies this very opulent but also very conspiratorial and corrupt city in which the story is set. And they would see, and one of those pieces of ornamentation is a mask, and behind that they would see a silhouette of a woman holding two swords, and her face lines up exactly behind the mask that we see. And so she sort of transcends the world behind her that's all in shadow, and the world in front that is all of this opulence. And that's very much how the character that we come to know in the first chapters as Lady Consequence, a duelist whose identity no one knows. That's how she comes into the story.
I just think that cover is gorgeous. Whoever did the cover, if you want to do a shout out to them, and it is a gorgeous cover. It kind of sells the book itself, right? The cover.
Yeah, no, it is wonderful. So the original design was, there's a company, I think it's a Ukrainian design firm called Miblart, and they're absolutely excellent. They did, I think, 22 revisions on one of the covers I had them do. In fact, after they did the cover design for Our Lady of Blades, they said, please don't call us again. Years later, they were kind enough to then do another cover for me for Crucible of Chaos, which is also part of this world of the Court of Shadows. So that, thankful for that. But when the design was first done, and in the years between, because this is a book that, I've been a full-time novelist for about 12 years, but this is my 18th novel. And so usually, obviously, I write fairly expeditiously, but this is a book that's taken me 7 years to write. And so in that time, styles changed and things like that. And I didn't feel like it was quite powerful enough, in terms of captivating the eye. So I turned to a good friend of mine, Mike Shackle, also a fantasy author, I think, author of The Lost War, who's also a terrific artist. And he basically recreated the key sort of elements of the cover and this new figure. It's fascinating because if you look in, for stock art online, for example, it's very easy to find images of men with swords looking, powerful. And you can find lots of pictures of women with swords, but they're very sexualized. To try to find one of a woman that looks strong, feminine but strong, and in command is very, very difficult. And so thankfully, Mike completely created the image. And so that's why the cover looks as fabulous as it does now.
I like the little egg Easter eggs that are on the cover, right? Mm-hmm. Like the mask, the bird, the swords. Are those part of the chapters that are in the book?
Yeah, so each book in the Court of Shadows series, it's basically a series of standalone novels. So you can read in any order or just read the one that interests you, and you'll still really, fully be able to absorb everything. There's nothing you have to have read first. But each one is set in a different city, and Rijou, the city in which Our Lady of Blades is set, is a very kind of, as I said, intricate, corrupt, wealthy city. And all of the sort of the noble houses are identified by a particular bird. And so the characters from that we see as the heroes in our story are from a family called the Vauquelin, whose sigil is the hummingbird. That's why there's a hummingbird on this cover. But there are these other houses that are very powerful and very dangerous, like the House of Engero, who are enemies of the Vauquelin, and their sigil is the falcon. And there's a House Hubris, which is the House of Owls, and House Thierry, which is the House of Robins, and all of their sense, the way that they speak about nobility there is very much governed by this sort of avian motif. So they speak about an ascendant house being the highest sort of house, and a rising house being under the wing of a greater house. So all of those symbols that you see on there reflect different pieces of that world of Rijou that we step inside.
So, Sebastian, do you think that having the many career paths that you've had has influenced your creativity and your writing skills?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was very fortunate. I took up fencing, I think, in my very early 30s. I had done it before, but I took it up more seriously in my 30s, and that led me to getting an opportunity to choreograph sword fights for theater plays. And one of the ones I got to do was a production of Richard III in London, where the producers and the directors had wanted to tell a different version of Richard III. So for anyone in your audience who doesn't sort of know the Shakespearean Richard III, in the Shakespeare version, which is the one we all see, Richard III is this villainous English king. They refer to him as a hunchback, and he's evil, and he kills these two children and all this kind of stuff. Historically, that's probably not true. Shakespeare was working for the Tudors, and it was Henry Tudor who took over from Richard III. So it was the end of the War of the Roses and all that kind of stuff was going on in the background. And so all of a sudden, Richard III becomes memorialized as this horribly, as they see him deformed and ugly villain. This production that I was hired to write the sword fights for wanted to do a more historical version. And so I loved the tension between this attempt to tell a true story and the false story that we've all been led to accept. And that led me to write Play of Shadows, which is another book in this series, which is a kind of swashbuckling adventure told in a theater, in which the magic system is actually built around acting in the theater, which is something I love. And so a lot of the experiences I had, choreographing for that production of Richard III, I brought into this story, including my favorite part, which is just the actors. Anyone who's had a chance to work with a bunch of actors, especially a bunch of theater actors, especially a bunch of young theater actors, will know that they're absolutely crazy and absolutely fabulous. And there's these strange tensions that you find within the cast, but then this tremendous unity between that cast and other productions. And so I brought all of that into Play of Shadows. With Our Lady of Blades, part of it was just I was an ombudsman in university, which is now I think we call it ombuds officer. At the time, they were still using the original term. I think it's either a Danish term or something like that, which is all about, you're there to sort of adjudicate or help people follow the process of the rules. You're not a judge in that system. You're not a lawyer in that system. You're there to advocate for the process, that it should be fair. And so some of those experiences, which were almost all positive ones, but you got to see how tenuous our notion of justice can be, especially in any kind of tribunal setting. And so one of the things, if anyone who reads fantasy or has read, medieval history, we often hear about trial by combat, which is always sort of presented as this very simple kind of, I think, sort of almost brutish form of, all right, well, there's an accusation, so then two people have a duel, and whoever's not dead, the gods, the god must agree is correct. And I wanted something that was far more Byzantine. Our legal system, both in the case of those of us in North America, but often I look at the British legal system, which is absolutely Baroque in how it works, and there's so much intricacy and detail, and so I wanted to bring that into this system of judicial dueling. So there's all these. It's not just trial by combat. There's all these different kinds of duels. For example, there's a sentencing duel in which someone appeals a sentence. You might be sentenced to 10 years in prison for a crime, and you can appeal that with steel, as they say. And if you have a champion, they duel against a prosecuting duelist. And for every cut your champion scores against the prosecuting duelist, it takes a year off your sentence. But for every cut the prosecuting duelist scores against your champion, that adds one. So you can walk out of court either scot-free or walk out of court, with 35 years in prison waiting. I love all of those intricacies.
You just never know, right? With that justice system that we have, right? You could go in for stealing a little jelly bean and get 10 years. And
you know what? And in fact, one of the things that opens this particular novel is a phenomenon that has started to appear in some jurisdictions in the United States, but also elsewhere, which is this phenomenon where someone is, someone gets a fine, and they don't even know that they have a fine. They don't even hear about it. It's too late till suddenly their car is taken away, because it turns out they've, because they failed to fine, somebody's gone to court and said, well, now we've got to extend this. And then all of a sudden they reach a point where they can be actually imprisoned. And, there is a principle that's sort of unwritten in our world, which is you should never go to jail for not having enough money. But you can go to prison for not having enough money. And one of the things that happens inside of Riju is that we start to see is this phenomenon where very rich houses file bogus lawsuits against skilled artisans, gem cutters, carpenters, people whose skills are tremendously valuable and who are otherwise protected by these guilds. So they file these false lawsuits, often through intermediaries, and then all of a sudden the Court of Coins decides this person owes money that they can't pay, and then all of a sudden they say, well, now you're a thief because you haven't paid this money, and therefore now you are going to prison, or in fact we're going to indenture you to the person to whom you owe this money. And so one of the things that's going on in this world and in this story is the realization that someone is trying to create a backdoor into slavery. Tristia, the country in which it's set, even though it's beset by its own problems and corruption, the one thing they stand on is that they abhor slavery in all its forms, because it's a country founded by former slaves. And so they realize, part of the background of the story is the realization that somebody is trying to bring it back.
So Sebastien, in your storytelling, do you bring some kind of education through the story as well, through the fantasy world?
I wouldn't say explicitly so, because there's always a risk when you have, if you have nothing to say in a fantasy novel, if you're just throwing in fantasy tropes and dragons and magic and swords and whatever else, then it can feel a little bit sugary and hollow. But if you go too far in the other direction, where you're trying to sort of really push a message, then it becomes a polemic. And people are very sophisticated, in terms of being aware when they're being preached at. And so what you're trying to do is sort of go, what would happen if? And just sort of explore themes that way through the lens of characters who disagree vehemently about what's important, what's not important, what's right and what's wrong. And that's, for me as a reader, when I'm exposed to that, that's when I feel like, oh, now I feel like I've given something that helps me think about things in my own world differently.
Absolutely. Well, Sebastien, we have some questions that are coming in. I just want to get those out to you, that some listeners here. The first one comes in from Bob, and it's, what was the biggest lesson learned from working in so many different professions before becoming a full-time author?
I think the biggest thing that it taught me is that writing is an inheritance of all of us. So everyone who can read and write is fundamentally qualified to be a novelist, to be a writer. The rest of it's just, hard work and insight and effort, and sometimes it's getting lucky. But because what I discovered is every single profession I've ever been involved with is something that has fueled some part of my writing, often in unexpected ways. So, for example, people always assume that all my, the sword fights and things that I write, I'm somewhat known for that, even though I don't think of myself as any kind of professional swordsman. But they often think that comes from my fight choreography experience. But in fact, a lot of that comes from my musical experience.
Oh.
Because, if you're writing a sword fight on the page, one of the things that you need the most is rhythm. The words have to speed up as the fight speeds up. The sentences have to get shorter as the fight speeds up. Sometimes when something is really dangerous, you have to suddenly stop the music, so to speak, and have this sort of long, tense pause, which is where you'll describe a bunch of things happening without anything moving. And so, having been a musician on stage for so long, you sort of develop a sense of this emotional rhythm, and that often informs my sword fights. Whereas a lot of my choreography experience, one of the things that comes up, especially Shakespeare plays, if you're writing the sword fights for a Shakespeare play, there's often no dialogue during that. And so, literally, if you read the original script, it'll say, Romeo says this to Paris, and then it just says, and they fight, and that's it. And so fight, 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 and it says Paris is dead. And so all of a sudden, you're supposed to have this sword fight in there, but there's no story happening otherwise. And so what you learn quickly when you start choreographing sword fights is you have to tell a whole story inside that sword fight. And you can't do it with words because you're not allowed to inject words into a Shakespeare play just because it's convenient. So you find ways to tell the story. And sometimes you'll arrange the choreography so that it subtly evokes, the whole story of the play up until that moment, or a particular tension between the two characters. And so learning all of that taught me that when you do write something like a sword fight or a battle scene, that it's not the words that have to propel the sense of what's happening. You have to do that through the action, that the action has to be dialogue in the same way that if you're doing drama, for example, a television drama, if you think of something like The West Wing, very famous series by Aaron Sorkin, terrific screenwriter, a protege of William Goldman, who wrote The Princess Bride and All the President's Men. He writes these workplace dramas where there's never anything going on except dialogue, but the dialogue becomes action. And so it taught me that sometimes the dialogue has to be action, and sometimes the action has to feel like dialogue.
I like the way that you've explained that, Sebastian, because, when you think of a sword fight, right, you just think of the sword swinging. But when you think of the music of the sword, you understand the story of the sword.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, very often and I've spoken to other fantasy authors who do this as well. When I'm trying to write a fight scene, an action scene, I will find a piece of music and I will compose the fight scene to that music. Now, because I have very strange taste, it's often going to be like a pop song, whereas I know other authors who, they find some great operatic, Wagnerian piece, and they do it to that. But I will often, in fact, when I was writing Traitor's Blade, my debut, because I think there's like 11 sword fights in that book, and each one is set to a different song. And some of them are absolutely, you would think were just the most bizarre songs in the world.
Well, you wouldn't do a sword fight with Lady in Red, would you?
Oh my goodness. No, I'm so traumatized by that song. Because, remember I was, operating, in the middle of trying to write, a novel, and suddenly I'm singing the song for the first time at someone's wedding. And I think the band for that wedding was myself, or I was just singing, a bass player, a drummer, and 2 keyboard players. So the only melodic instruments were the keyboards, and both keyboards broke at the same time. So this poor couple, it's their wedding song. And it's just me with my, at that moment in time, slightly scratchy voice, because it's quite a high song in places, a bass and drums. Fortunately, it turned out great, which was, the miracle of music and live bands, but it was terrifying. So I'm still traumatized by that song.
Well, we have another question for you, Sebastian, and it is from Mark. How did music influence your storytelling style and imagination?
So music for me comes in, it's specifically songs will come in, and sometimes they will lead me to a particular scene. So it's very often the case that when I'm writing a book, that I'll go for a run. I'm a terrible runner, but I'll go for a run, and I'll start listening to a song, and I'll be thinking of a scene, and I will just play that song on repeat for half an hour or an hour nonstop, because something about the song is becoming the engine of a scene. And I remember, what was the name? There was a Weezer song, Island in the Sun, I think it was called, that was the basis of the entire character of Athalia in the Greatcoats series, because there's all these there's some scenes in that book that happen, and they were all written because I was listening to that song. And it's functionally a song about, it's just, a guy talking about, finding an island in the sun with the girl that he's in love with and stuff like that. And because Traitor's Blade is a story where, it's fast paced, it's got a lot of thrills, but there's a lot of violence in Falkia, the main character's life. And, in fantasy novels, we rarely question the violence in the hero's life. And so it caused me to have this character named Athalia who tries to convince Falkia, 2/3 of the way through the book, look, there's this island that belongs to my family, and it's beautiful and it's peaceful. We could leave right now, and you would never again have to kill someone or risk being killed. And he's trying to protect the life of this young girl at the time. And she says the best way to protect her is let's leave now. And he can't, because he's still trapped in that cycle of conspiracy and violence and trying to avenge the death of the king that he loved, and all of these sort of things, and the death of his own wife before that. And so that song, that Weezer song, which nobody would listen to and think, oh yeah, no, that's the basis of a bunch of scenes in the fantasy novel. But for me, that's often what happens. Sometimes in the weirdest ways imaginable. Like I'll hear a weird like country song, like, Save a Horse, Ride a Cowboy, which...
That's actually a good song, but I've always wondered about the lyrics of that song.
it's a little over the top, but it has this kind of funny plotting rhythm to it that it's so swaggering. And so I used that in one of the the Argosy novels, which is the series that came after the Spellslinger series, because there's a certain cowboy vibe to the Argosy. There are these wandering gamblers who, outwit wizards, and even though they have no powers of their own, and I love them as heroes because all of their abilities are basically human abilities rather than magical ones. But that cowboy swagger vibe was just so present in that song. Of course, the problem is you listen to one of those songs for an hour at a time, and then pretty soon when you go to sleep, you're still hearing them. So that's always a little rough.
As you're sharing that, Sebastian, I'm seeing this cowboy with a sword trying to swing the sword instead of a gun. It's like, no, but that's not for you. It's the brother over there that needs that sword.
No, there's some cowboy sword fights, I promise you. And,
oh, is there?
Well, Spellslinger is very much so. Spellslinger is a fantasy series about a young man named Kellen from a society where magic is really everything. His parents are Lord Maguses, and his younger sister is the most promising mage of their generation. All he wants to be is a mage. And at the beginning of the story, his own magic is suddenly disappearing, right on the verge of his mage's trials. And in a lot of fantasy, what that would set off is a story of the young man who becomes the greatest of all mages. He finds that his power is just more. And I really don't find that as a good parallel for life as I've experienced it. And so I ended up writing he meets this older woman named Farius Parfax, who is one of these Argosy. And she treats magic as almost a child's toy, right? Even though it's deadly and it's powerful and it dominates this world, she sees it as an act of childishness because it's all about having power over other people. And so she starts to show him the way of the Argosy, which is this other path. And so he becomes more of a trickster character throughout that series. And so there's a lot of cowboy swagger that comes in that. In fact, one of the 7 Argosy talents, they have these things called the talents, which include things like self-defense and, like she calls it dancing. But one of them is, some of the Argosy call it daring, but she just calls it swagger, and it's part of that cowboy swagger. If you ever, you see, I used to play these small towns all over British Columbia. Sometimes you see like a very cowboy personality swagger into a bar. Like, there's some power in that move.
Well, I come from Northern Ontario, right? And people would walk in with their cowboy boots and their little, like, they tried to swagger in, right? In the 80s and 90s, right? They'd come in and they'd think that they were this cool cowboy in a little Northern Ontario town, right?
I'll tell you, one of my first music gigs, I think we only knew 10 songs, and we were playing a bar in a place called Pemberton, British Columbia, which is a very sort of rural community, very kind of cowboyish community at the time. This is in the 90s, and we were these kids from Vancouver, and I don't know why I had a hairdryer in my backpack, but we walked in with our gear into the bar, because you had to go through the bar to get to where our rooms were going to be, and we had to set up. And there was a fight. There was a knockdown, drag out fight, and everybody's watching with all these cowboys and these tough guys from a nearby reservation, and it's just all like, and then we're walking across suddenly, and for some reason, my hairdryer fell out of my backpack and hit the floor, and all of a sudden, there was no longer a debate in that room as to who was the least manly person there.
Well, you know what? The hair dryers kind of look like a gun, right? Kind of like a cowboy style.
Yeah,
you're coming in with your blade and blowing.
No, it was pretty hilarious. They were wonderful, actually. They were so lovely to us, and yeah, it was. I had a great time. But that was a true moment of terror because just everybody suddenly stopped. Like it was, you know what I mean?
You're like that guy. Well, we have a question for Francis for you, and it's: I've always wondered, when creating a character, do you start with the strengths or the flaws?
That's a great question. I really start with their struggle, right? Like, what are they struggling against? You know, I often say, you know, with friends who are, when I'm with other novelist friends, you know, also we'll talk about different novelists and what they're doing, whether we agree with it or not, or think it's good or not. And I'll say, like, if somebody's struggling to achieve something with their writing, I always have an admiration for that. You know, if you're reaching for something, then I think you know, you're doing the job of a writer. A writer should be reaching for something. We shouldn't just be, you know, I meet some writers who'll say, you know what, I'm in the entertainment business. I give people what they want. You know, well, that's fine. And maybe that works for people. But for me, I've always got to be struggling with something. And so when I'm looking at a character, I'm often starting with, what are they struggling against? It could be a kid who's struggling at school because, you know, they just want to quit school, but they don't want to disappoint their grandparents. And, you know, something as simple as that. And they're just struggling with, what does it mean if I leave school? Am I a rotten person because I'm disappointing my grandparents? If I stay in school, am I a rotten person because I'm not being true to myself? So I start from, what is that struggle? And then that will guide me towards their strengths and their weaknesses. I will say it's more common for me to go from there to asking, what makes this character someone I would like a strength, like something admirable about them. And then it's only later as I'm like, okay, well, if they're struggling to do something that they think is right, and they've got these positive strengths, these good qualities, why is it failing? And that's where I'll start to find their weaknesses.
Well, it's kind of like when you do a job interview, right? They always ask you what your weaknesses are and what your strengths are, but they'll always start with the weakness first.
Yeah. My weaknesses, I work too hard on the job. I just can't stop.
Are you a perfectionist?
No. I don't think I'm a perfectionist. I think my wife and possibly my editors would say that I'm a perfectionist. I'm, you know, the weird thing about writing a novel to me is that, unlike so many other forms of art, you get 1,000 tries at it. You know, you can just keep changing. You don't have to start out being a great prose writer. Like, no one cares. You know, let's say we had a challenge right now. We had 5 people who wanted to be novelists, and we said, you have 90 seconds to write the best opening sentence about a fantasy novel with sword fighting in it. You know, and then that's it. You know what we would learn at the end of that 90 seconds? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter, right? What matters is who finds the best sentence. And you know what? It also doesn't matter if the person who finds the best sentence finds it because they sat there by themselves in a room with a bottle of Jack Daniels and an old 1940s typewriter for 16 days straight, or whether they got there because they watched a bunch of great TV shows and talked to some friends and asked friends for help. And what do you think about this? All that matters is the text. It's what ends up on the page, and you get all those tries at it. So for me, that also creates the realization that that process stops only when the book is published. But once it's published, that's it. You know, Our Lady of Blades took me 7 years to write. There's nothing in my entire life that's taken me 7 years before, right? But that's because it took 7 years to get to the point where I could say, if not a single word of this ever changes again, I will stand by every word that's in there. It does not mean that they are perfect. It means that they are honest.
Yeah.
You know, and that's true of every book I've written. But sometimes you get there in a short amount of time. Malevolent 7, which came out in 2023, which is a novel of mine, it became this fairly reasonable hit. Took me a month to write. I wrote it in February of 2020 when the pandemic first, you know, the lockdowns first started from the pandemic. I was in a bad mood. I said, I'm just going to write a book just to entertain myself. I'm not even going to sell it. And I wrote that book in a month, and it became a hit. It's taken me 7 years to write Our Lady of Blades, and I doubt it's going to sell half as many copies as Malevolent 7. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I hope it sells a million copies, but you know what I mean? Like, it's just, you stop, you know, the key is, it's not about being a perfectionist. It's about reaching that point where you're like, no, that is the best reflection of the best I could possibly do when I was doing it.
Yeah. Well, we have a question here, Sebastien, from Jonathan for you is how much of your own adventures and travels find their way into the worlds you create?
So quite often, one of the questions you asked before, when we were scheduling the interview is, what are the three words, and so for me, it's adventure, romance, and travel are kind of the three pillars for my life. And travel is that important. And I'm blessed that, my wife and I share that. And so we travel all the time. And the thing about travel is it helps you see both the commonalities in human beings, but also the differences in culture and the differences in values. And that, and what's fascinating is you can meet people in another country who on the surface seem to have completely opposing values to your own. And those values are sincere, and they clash. I mean, there are reasons why we have culture clashes in the world. And yet the earnestness, the honesty behind those values is itself a kind of shared value across cultures. And so often what travel does, I'm not someone who goes, oh, I went to Sri Lanka, so I'm now going to take cultures from Sri Lanka and kind of transpose them into my fantasy world. I don't tend to do that. First of all, I don't know how to do it. And second of all, I think it was N.K. Jesman who said something brilliant. He said, don't steal other people's cultures and just file the serial numbers off so you can stick them in your books. And but that sense of difference and the sense of why does this phenomenon exist in this culture and not another one? Why, the values. I remember when I was certifying for my advanced actor combatant training in the United Kingdom. You had to do these tests, you do these choreographed sword fights to certify as an actor combatant. And I remember afterwards, I passed, but I didn't do that great. And one of the instructors said, "You're just working too hard. Like you did dialogue in all your fights. You didn't have to. We only said you had to do it for one." He said, "You're thinking like a North American. You're thinking like, you got to, that acting is this magical thing. Like here, it's like masonry. It's work. You show up for work, you do your job, just do the job." And I found that so fascinating, the notion of that for one culture, you would demystify acting to that level. And in another, we tend to constantly try to, in fact, mystify it. We try to make it magical. We talk a lot in North America about, method actors. So, they're training to be hitmen. So they start going out every night stalking people, and as if it's going to make the acting better, which, who knows, maybe it does.
Well, it scares everybody.
But certainly for me, what that does is it reminds me that, our cultures are not all the same. And our fantasy cultures, the most fun thing I find in writing a new book is asking a question: why do we have something in our culture that, what would happen if it didn't exist? And why don't we have this other thing in our culture? So for example, Play of Shadows. One of the things I was really fascinated by, there was some celebrity thing going on, right? Something where some celebrity said something and then everybody gets upset or they get excited or whatever. And we sort of valorize celebrities a lot, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it made me wonder, like, why is it that we don't have a belief that when a truly great actor is playing a historical part, why don't we have a belief that they're actually channeling the real historical spirit of that character, right? Like that's a good superstition to introduce, but we don't have it. And wouldn't it be fascinating if you had a city where theater is very, very important, people value it highly, and the most prized plays are the historical plays, and that they believe there are these certain class of actors called varistors who are so good that when they go on stage, they actually channel the spirit of the historical figures they're playing. And that became the basis of Play of Shadows, where Damalas, who is playing a bit part, he's playing a herald in the scene, suddenly blanks out on stage and blurts out this completely treasonous monologue about the city's most famous historical hero. And that sets off this whole chain of events where it turns out actually there is a real ability and he is channeling this spirit from the past. And all of that came from just going, why is it we prize celebrities, but we don't believe in the sincerity of what they're doing when they're on stage?
Yeah. That is a good question, Sebastien. And why do we follow them so closely, but we don't follow our own community and fellowmen, like, that are in our own genres, like musicians and artists and that as well, right? The celebrities are always put to the top. And there was a post that I seen, like, would you start following your friends like you would follow a celebrity who doesn't even know who you are, right? Let's start getting that into society and start sharing that as well.
Well, and we have, yeah, and you're right. And we have such a weird relationship with celebrity, which is part of what I want to explore in Play of Shadows, where we will valorize them and lionize them right up until they say something that we don't like. And then suddenly, what's the first thing we say? What was it the Dixie Chicks were told, right? When they,
oh yeah, I'm not ready to be nice, that song, right?
well, it's because they were getting all these death threats and all these politicians telling them, shut up and sing.
Yeah.
And so why was it they were beloved? They were the voice of the heartland. They say the one thing somebody doesn't agree with. And instead of people going, hey, well, we think that their music is so potent that it feels like it speaks of the heartland to us. But as soon as they say something we don't like, oh, well, now we're going to tell them to shut up and sing.
Yep.
So yeah, it's a very interesting phenomenon. But that, again, there's a definition of sociology. I can't remember where it comes from, but where sociologists see the ordinary in the strange and the strange in the ordinary, which is a way of saying, instead of assuming that the culture that we're in is what is normal, and then everything else that's not like it is weird, ask why, try to make what you think is the weird culture, try to come up with why that's normal. Why is that exactly the normal, right thing you would do? And instead of treating your own culture as normal, ask, all these things that we do, try to imagine them as strange, try to imagine them as absurd, and then ask, why do they exist? And as a fantasy novelist, that's kind of almost one of your best tools.
Well, we have a comment here that I'd like to read out to you. It says, wishing Sebastien continue success with his books, adventures, and future creative projects. And then we have a question here from Mario for you. It is, what is one adventure from your life that completely changed the way you see the world?
Wow, that's a good one. I mean, certainly that camping trip when I was 16, I viewed the world in a serious way. But sometimes it's, the interesting thing is sometimes the effects of travel and adventure are much more subtle. That you go off and the only thing you're conscious of feeling is, for example, feeling homesick. But then you get home and then you feel good for a minute, and then you start to realize, oh no, there's something else, and that trip has sort of altered it for you. But one thing that was kind of interesting, this is not a story I actually like telling because I don't sound good in it, but it's a true and honest story, so it's worth telling. Early, I think it was 2001, 2002 or so, my wife and I went to Egypt for the first time. And you meet all these wonderful Egyptian people. And I remember there was a guide for this Nile cruise that we were on, and we sort of became friendly with him. And when you're a North American, especially then, in that period, there's always an assumption that people want you to tip them, that you should, and it makes sense, right? Like, if what amounts to $2 for us is the equivalent of, $50 for someone else, or has a meaningful impact on their week, then why not sort of try to be generous? And after the tour was over, and he stuck around, and we were talking for a few hours, and just pretty much as friends, right? Or as acquaintances. And then at the end, I don't know why, but I thought, oh, I should do this, and I pulled out like $20, and I said thank you so much, and gave him $20. And he smiled and he said thank you, and that was it. And Christina, my wife, said, you just offended him so badly. Why would you do that? Like, he was reaching out to you as an equal, as a friend, and you just sort of ended things by going, hey, you're still who you are, and I'm still this tourist, and so it was a very strange thing, but it really kind of taught me, like, what that changed in me is to go, you have to really, when you're meeting new people from other cultures, you have to be really aware of when they're just genuinely reaching out to you as a fellow human being. That know that a lot of the interactions that we're taught as travelers or as tourists to see as kind of these sort of rules. Oh, everybody who's nice to you in a country like Egypt, they expect you to tip them, or that's why they're doing it. So, and in fact, multiple times on that trip and a subsequent trips, we discovered that's not the case at all. And so it's actually very difficult to navigate, because you don't want to disappoint someone. If somebody spent an hour trying to be nice to you because they actually need the money and they're hoping for a tip, and you don't give them one, then you're kind of offending them a different way. So yeah, that changed the way that I look at travel, and it informs my writing in the sense of very often characters really wrestling with understanding what is the nature of our relationship in this moment.
Well, Sebastien, do you want to hold up the book, and we'll tell everybody where they can get the book, when it's coming, if it's out, where all that good stuff, and then just spell out your website for the audio listeners.
Yeah, so I'm very easy to reach at decastell.com. It's DECASTELL.com. And there's a contact page there. I'm happy to hear from people. I reply to every email. Sometimes it takes me a while because there's a lot of them, but I'm always happy to hear from readers. Our Lady of Blades is out. It came out on May 18th, I think, in North America. And it's available in all the major bookstores in hardback. It's available as an ebook. The audiobook is absolutely fantastic. I'm very blessed to have two of the best audiobook narrators in the business who do all of my books. And this one, it's Kristen Atherton and Joe Jameson. Kristen Atherton's performance is amazing. One of the things I always said from the very beginning when my first books were getting audiobooks done was, I don't want someone to just sit there and read the book aloud. I could do that myself. I want someone to perform the book. And Kristen Atherton brings these really wonderful, nuanced performances that just, for me, honestly, before doing this interview, when I was walking around this afternoon cleaning the house, I was listening to the audiobook, because one of the biggest joys for me as an author is listening to the audiobook, because it's this story that I love, that I've written, but now it's got all these new layers added to it by an actor, by a professional, bringing their own creative voice to it. So, which is not to say don't buy the hardback. You should buy the hardback because it's gorgeous and wonderful, but you can buy both.
Well, it's with the audiobooks, it's a different level of getting the story as well. Mm-hmm. Because like you said, like you didn't want them just to read it. And there are a lot of those books out there, audio books that are just read, right? Page for page. There's no character in it, like no performance in the words and the paper. But when you're doing the audiobook, you're saying that, you're getting a performance. So you can just sit there and you can almost see like a theater right in front of you as you're listening to the book.
Absolutely. And actually, if any of your listeners want to, I think they can do this for free, is find Way of the Argosy, which is the first of the Argosy books of mine. Find the first chapter excerpt on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or wherever you like. Find that and bring it up on the screen. And then find the first chapter excerpt of the audiobook and read the book as you listen to the audiobook. Because what was fascinating for me is there's a repeated line. The first line in Way of the Argosy is, "Be a good girl now." And it's Farias Parfax. She's she's about 11 years old. Her people are refugees. They're in the middle of her tribe is in the middle of being basically massacred by mages, by these wizards, because they see them as demonic. And this old woman has tried to save her by hiding her in this cavern, even though the old woman's now dead. But the last thing the old woman said was, "Be a good girl now." And Farias, because she's this traumatized 11-year-old girl in the middle of a disaster, is just thinking everywhere she goes, that's what everyone says to her, "Be a good girl now." And every culture where they go to try to get help, she's always told, "Be a good girl now," and how it has all these different meanings. So on the page, when I'm writing it, that's what you're seeing, "Be a good girl now." And the subtext is sort of there, but when Kristen Atherton performs it, and she's suddenly, every time she's reading the line, you can hear just a tiny bit more brittleness, and you realize what's happening to Farias's, psyche. She's trying to hold it together, but this is a terrible thing that's taking place. I just absolutely adored it. So it's a fun way to hear just how potent an actor's performance is when they're doing an audiobook.
And what final message would you have for everybody tonight, Sebastien?
You know, just be kind to each other and look for the hopefulness in all the things around you. Because if your audience are anything like me, they're constantly seeing things on social media that feel like they're designed to make us angry and feel like everything's going badly and feel like the world's, you know, coming to an end. And then you go outside into the world and you know, talk for 3 minutes to a barista in a coffee shop, and, you know, walk in a park, and suddenly it feels like actually the world is a pretty wonderful place. So that's so this is not so much advice for your audience as advice for myself, reminding me that you know, that every time you go out into the actual real world, you find some reason for hope.
Oh, thank you so much, Sebastien. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I want to get to know those books a little bit more. And I think I'm going to grab me an audiobook, because, you know, that's something I do not have. I do not have one single audiobook. That I think maybe you'll be the first. I'll do that.
I'd be honored. Yeah, try Way of the Argosy. I highly recommend that one. But thanks so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. I'm just going to do a quick recap of what tonight's tea time was, and we will be back tomorrow. That's right, Miss Liz is coming back on Friday. I know it's not a regular scheduled day, but we do have 2 incredible tea times coming back tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again with you guys. What an engaging and meaningful conversation tonight. Sebastien, thank you for bringing your creativity, honesty, humor, and insight to the tea time table. Your storytelling reminds readers that fantasy worlds may be imagined, but the emotions, struggles, fears, hopes, and choices within them are deeply real. Tonight's conversation explored storytelling, identity, resilience, friendship, and the incredible role imaginational plays in helping people navigate life itself. One of the strongest reminders from today is this: stories are not just entertainment, they are reflections of humanity. Through your characters and worlds, readers discover courage, vulnerability, loyalty, redemption, and the understanding that nobody's journey is simple or perfect. You also reminded us that some of the greatest lessons come from flawed characters, learning who they truly are while facing impossible odds. Here are some food for thought to leave with everyone tonight. What if the stories we are most drawn to are actually helping us better understand parts of ourselves we have not fully explored yet? Because sometimes fiction tells the truth in ways reality struggles to explain. Thank you, Sebastien, for continuing to create worlds that inspire imagination while also revealing the depth of the human experience. Until next time, keep telling stories that matter, keep challenging perspectives, and keep serving real life tea one conversation at a time. And I'll see everybody tomorrow, and we'll do this all over again.
Bye.